What Carroll and his cohort of revisionists propose is a massive conspiracy, perpetrated as an intentional deceit to take events which never happened and pretend as though they had, to take the Jewish scriptures and create stories based on certain prophecies. And what do they offer as evidence of this fraud? The fact that rabbinical Judaism has rejected the Gospels. If the remnant of one sect of Judaism, the Pharisees, did not acknowledge these events as true, then they obviously must be false. He presents Talmudic Judaism as the final arbiter of history. Christianity has a problem, he proposes, in several places in the book. If Jesus was in fact the Messiah, why did his own people reject him? He ignores the ample historical evidence of the Jewish expectation of a different kind of Messiah, and two unsuccessful rebellions against Rome, which were predicated on precisely such a Messiah. Simon Bar Kokhba, the leader of the second disastrous rebellion, was declared by the leading rabbis of his time as the promised Messiah, and he only led his people to ruin. Carroll conveniently ignores this fact, as well as he ignores other historical references. It's not within the scope of this paper to critique rabbinical Judaism or to argue the striking dissimilarities between rabbinical Judaism and the Judaism practiced before the destruction of the Jewish temple. But I do think it is important to come to an understanding of the underlying motive of Talmudic Judaism in advocating against the historical veracity of the Gospels. With the acceptance of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, Talmudic Judaism was presented with an untenable situation. The Messiah, which the rabbis had rejected, had now become the God of the empire. And from a religious and political standpoint, Judaism faced tremendous social pressure to conform. In this aspect, one can feel tremendous sympathy for the Jews and denounce any personal hatred for them as a people because of their rejection of Christianity. The numerous examples of anti-Semitic hatred cited in Carroll's book are indeed a blight against Christianity. But what Carroll fails to understand is that the treatment of the Jews under the papal church and then under the Protestants is more indicative of more reflection of the Western Christian ethos and not indicative of the treatment of the Jews under Eastern Orthodoxy. John Chrysostom wrote against the Judaizers, as he called them, because he believed them to be practitioners of a false religion, not out of any personal animosity to the Jewish race. He wished to correct them in what he saw as their false understanding of history. He would have found the history of treatment of the Jews under the medieval papal yoke unacceptable, and the Holocaust cannot be seen as acceptable under any interpretation of Christian dogma. Christ called on his followers to love their enemies and to pray for those who persecute them. With understandable revulsion, Carroll catalogs numerous examples of appellations of Jews as Christ killers. He cites examples of such attributions in the liturgical traditions of both the Orthodox East and the Papal West, but he obviously doesn't understand the context in which they were written. The Gospels clearly implicate the Jewish temple leadership in the death of Christ, yet Carroll sees these as later fabrications and a massive fraud upon the Roman peoples. For him, only the Jews, and to a lesser degree the followers of Islam, have a clear picture of who Jesus really was. It is for this reason that a film such as Mel Gibson's The Passion, which seeks to depict the events surrounding the crucifixion, including the trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin, has met with such resistance from both Jewish and so-called progressive circles. The critics see it as a further attempt to deceive and defraud a modern audience. Carroll repeatedly argues in the book that the church, in order to make amends for its long history of anti-Semitism, must reconsider the foundational documents of its faith. A short defense of the Scriptures. At the heart of this renunciation of the New Testament, witness to the life of Christ, is a complete misunderstanding as to what role the New Testament plays in the life of the church. For the first followers of Christ, the Old Testament was the only scriptures they revered. They saw in the words of Moses and in the words of the prophets an image of Christ, and they understood the Old Testament appearances of God to the Hebrew peoples as appearances of the pre-incarnate Word of God. St. Paul, specifically in his epistle to the Hebrews and elsewhere scattered through many of his letters, makes numerous direct references and allusions to the Logos, or Word of God, as revealed in the Old Testament Scriptures. Carroll, following Dominic Croissant, calls this prophecy historicized, claiming the followers of Jesus went to the Old Testament and fabricated stories about Jesus to show how he fulfilled the Scriptures. But from the beginning, there was a principle of hermeneutic, or interpretation, at work, which saw events witnessed by Jesus' disciples having direct reference to the Jewish Scriptures. The church only reluctantly began to consider creating a second testament to augment the Old, and they never saw the New Testament as supplanting or replacing the Old. If, as Carroll claims, the early Christians wanted to separate themselves from Judaism, why did they adopt both the Scriptures of the Jews and their worship patterns? If they were so quick to supplant the Old Testament with something entirely new, why wasn't the New Testament canon finalized until 394 at the Council of Carthage? The Christian people always saw themselves as heirs to the promises made to Abraham and as the new Israel, eagerly anticipated by the prophets.